Hello everyone, welcome to today's lecture. This is Dr. Manisha Mirdha and today we would be speaking on the topic procedural democracy and its critique. This topic has been divided into two parts, so let's begin with the first part. Before we get into today's topic, I would very briefly like to touch upon certain issues that we had talked about in the last lecture, which was on democracy, because we are going to be speaking on procedural democracy today. So therefore it becomes imperative that we have a slight understanding of what democracy was, which we had discussed in our previous lecture. So if you go back, we said democracy is a government of the people, by the people and for the people, which is a very famous definition which has been given by Abraham Lincoln. After which we had also discussed the difference between democracy and autocracy. We had tried to understand the difference between direct and indirect democracy, and with all the definitions and the connotations that we dealt with of democracy, we also understood that that's a very challenged and a very contested concept. So going on further with this, today we start with procedural democracy. Before we get into the topic of procedural democracy, it again becomes very important for us to understand a couple of things. The first being that we will try to get into the understanding of the elements of democracy, and then why democracy is important. Why is it that people decide to choose this as their form of governance? So there might be reasons for that. So we'll try to get into this, and then eventually we come to our topic of procedural democracy. So first let's start with elements of democracy. There are three core elements of democracy, they being individual sovereignty, equality amongst citizens, and democratic norms and values. This is a diagram which will give you a clearer picture of what do I mean by elements of democracy. Let's start with the first concept. So democracy is essentially the idea that political sovereignty resides at the level of the individual. So in this sense, a political community derives its supreme power and authority from the consent of the people within that community. If we define sovereignty as the absolute authority and supreme power of political rule, then democratic sovereignty is not reserved for particular groups or individuals, but rather a general right dispersed at the level of individuals within a political community. So what is meant by this? The first part is trying to say that the people of the state, the citizens of the country, are sovereign. They have absolute power, they have absolute authority to decide what kind of rule they would want to have for themselves. And this authority, this power is not endowed to only a few select people. It is not divinely ordained. It is not based on principles of heredity. You being a part of that state are by your legal right having that sovereign power. So this is the first concept which talks about the sovereignty of the individuals. The second element of democracy is that there should ideally be political equality amongst citizens. Citizenship is a legal status that confers onto an individual the formal recognition that they are members of a sovereign state. Citizens in non-democratic societies may still have rights, but political rights are generally very limited or absent. So the second element of democracy is trying to say that equality is a legal right. It is not that we have this benefit by somebody's mercy. The very fact that we are a part of a democratic state gives us this authority of equality. So this is a legal right that every individual, every citizen of the state has. And the third element of democracy, which talks about norms, values and rules. Now this third element of democracy constitutes ideas that strengthen and reinforce the above elements. because norms, values and rules affirm and solidify individual sovereignty and political equality amongst citizens. And this last element suggests that abstract concepts such as sovereignty and equality are not enough. Democracy requires a set of norms and values that affirm its place in society. So, this third element is trying to tell us that the previous two elements, which was of sovereignty and equality, will not make sense till this third element is solidified in the governance, because no state can function only on the procedures of equality and sovereignty. The aspect of norms and values becomes very essential, otherwise it becomes nothing but something like a zombie democracy. So, this is something which makes us value our democracy. This is something which gives us the norms of behavior of that democratic state. So, therefore, these are the three elements of democracy. Having said this, I move to my next question, which says, why should we choose democracy? What are the justifications why we have decided to be a part of this kind of governance? So, let us explore three justifications as to why democracy is a worthy political goal. They have tried to give three answers to this question, which was why should we choose democracy, and the appropriate answer to this question would be the three reasons being aggregative, deliberative and radical. Now, what is meant by these three terms, that these three words that we have used over here? Let us get into that. So, the first thing we said was we may choose democracy because it is an effective system for aggregating political preferences. In short, democracy allows us to vote and state our preferences in such a way that we can tally up our choices, a numerical aggregation of votes to determine the best course of policies. Now, what does this mean? What they are trying to tell us over here is that the benefit of democracy is that eventually the decision is taken based on the majority view. So, if there is any contentious issue, if there is any debatable issue where the state cannot come to any conclusive decision, then usually it is put to vote. So, when we use this phrase, let us put it to vote, this is actually what is meant by this aggregating political preferences. We give it a numerical value, and based on that numerical value, the decisions are based. So, therefore, one of the reasons why we would choose democracy is because of this aggregative nature of that. And what would be the advantage of this? The advantage, natural advantage of this is that majority opinion wins. So, therefore, whatever is the view of the majority of the people of the state, that will prevail. So, that is the benefit of this. So, at the outer surface it looks as if this should be beneficial, there should be nothing wrong in this, but we have also said that there is a disadvantage to the aggregative view of democracy. So, what could be the disadvantage of aggregating these preferences of people? A disadvantage of this aggregative value would be that all we do is we end up tallying the numerical value, tallying up the preferences of the people. This makes it to be a kind of a cold and calculative decision, because at times it might, if I just cite an example for this. So, there was this issue which was like, it dates back to 1858 I think, and this was a debate which was going on between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, and the issue was on slavery. So, they had to decide whether they should continue or abolish slavery, and Stephen Douglas was of the view that let us put it to vote, which seems to be the most commonsensical answer to this. Whatever the decision of the state would be, let that will prevail. But Abraham Lincoln was actually against this, because he believed that this is such a view, this has such a moral value attached to it, that putting it to vote is something which can never give us the right conclusion to that, because even if we have a minority opinion against this, this is something which will always have a problem. If I cite another example to explain this point which I am talking about here, the disadvantage of aggregative tendency of democracy, let me give you the example of the debates which were going on while the Constituent Assembly was framing the constitution of the country, our own country. So at that time, there were various issues, various contentious issues, say for example, whether we should be a unitary state or a federal state, or the language provision, which should be the national language, English, Hindi, which one. So these were very debatable issues, but the framers of the constitution decided that they will not put this to vote. Reason being that they did not want a majority view. They wanted a consensus amongst all the people gathered there to take a decision. So they took a lot of time. It was a time consuming process, but they came to a decision. So therefore, my point over here is that though this makes a lot of sense that you have a majoritarian view, but sometimes that might not be the best way. So this is about the aggregative tendency of democracy. The second justification for democracy is deliberative. Deliberative democracy suggests that we value self-rule because it provides an area for discussion, compromise and consensus. Advantage, obviously we can understand, we value democracy because it provides a venue for a deliberative process of fair, transparent and rational dialogue necessary to bring justice. So yes, this is again a great advantage of democracy, which is that we have a very transparent system. A lot of reasoned and informed discussion and debate and dialogue can go on with this, and which would generally come to the most suitable conclusive answer to that problem. So can there be a disadvantage to this also? Yes, there can be a disadvantage because deliberation may not always provide such a clear conclusion. One person's values and political preferences can be simply incomparable with another person's values and preferences. Now what does this mean? If I just give you an example to explain what I am trying to say over here. So a few months back there was this heated debate which was going on the issue of abortion. Alright. Now this is such an issue where the two views, a pro-life and a pro-choice view, are the two views which are completely incomparable. There is no middle ground. You cannot find a compromise between these two. So however hard and however informed deliberation or dialogue you get into, you will not be able to come to a conclusive answer because the two views are completely incomparable, completely incompatible. So therefore that might be a problem with democracy, that it this deliberative aspect of it might at times raise issues. And the third justification for democracy is radical. In this view, we value democracy because democracy gives individuals power that makes government responsible and accountable to their needs. So yeah, advantage, that power is won through direct action of citizens who demand action or recognition for government. Yes, the advantage, that power is won on the street. You have complete right to question the representatives of your country to give answers to your queries. If there are things which are not going right, you have this radical benefit given to the citizens where they can question the governance and the bureaucrats and the public officials. So this is definitely an advantage. What can be the disadvantage of this? The disadvantage of this could be that at times this power to seek answers can get slightly violent, and sometimes more than slightly violent. So this is something which can lead to disruption, this is something which can lead to chaos, this is something which can lead to violence and can completely upturn the system, you know. So therefore this at times, this radical benefit that we are talking of about democracy can at times lead to hazardous consequences. So that is the disadvantage. So this is what I was speaking of, why should we choose democracy, and these are the three apparent answers to this question, as in why should we choose democracy: aggregative, deliberative and radical, and I just explained that to you. uh, if I just have this question in your mind, which possibly is also posing in your mind, that is there any one of them which is more important, or is it that there is a sequential preference that we can give to these three values that we spoke of, or what is the relevance of these three benefits of democracy? This is actually a tricky question, and this cannot have a very conclusive and objective answer to that, and because of which we will be proceeding on to our topic for the day, which is procedural democracy, because this question makes us ponder on the issue that what are the procedures, what are the techniques, what are the methods which actually end up giving us those rules of law, or that rule of law that we talk about. So, I now move to the crux of the issue, which is what is procedural democracy. So, procedural democracy is a term used to denote the particular procedures such as regular elections based on universal suffrage that produce an electorally legitimated government. Procedural democracy, with its centering of electoral processes as the basis of democratic legitimacy, is often contrasted with substantive democracy, which centers on equal participation of all groups in society in the political process as the basis of legitimacy. Now, what does this mean? Procedural democracy is one aspect of democracy. Procedural democracy is something which talks about the procedures, the techniques, the institutions of democracy. Procedural democracy, as the slide shows, is something which talks about elections. Elections has been used as an example of procedural democracy. Now, elections as an example of procedural democracy becomes such an appropriate explanation that at times this itself is used as a synonym of procedural democracy. Procedural democracy can be very well understood by the example of elections, those free and fair elections that are held in any country at regular intervals of time. We have also used a term called substantive democracy over here. We will be getting into the understanding of substantive democracy in the coming slides and the second part of this lecture. But right now, I would just like to say that we cannot gain a holistic understanding of procedural democracy till we gain an understanding of what substantive democracy is, because both go hand in hand. So, therefore, we will also try to understand what substantive democracy is once we have understood what procedural democracy is. So, procedural democracy emphasizes the importance of fair and transparent procedures in decision making rather than the outcome of those decisions. This means that in procedural democracy, the focus is on ensuring that every citizen has an equal say in decision making and that these processes are carried out in an open and transparent manner. Procedural democracy is based on the idea that all citizens have the right to participate in the democratic process regardless of their individual beliefs or interests. So, here two major points emerge. One is that procedural democracy is not concerned about the outcome or the result, and this can put a question mark on this entire conceptualization which we will be dealing with. So, this is the first understanding, that this is something which does not focus on the results, and secondly, it assumes that all these citizens have the equal right and the opportunity to participate in the political participation processes, which again is something which makes us raise our eyebrows. Going on further with the understanding of procedural democracy, democracy actually can be understood by two different views, the minimalist and the maximalist view. Minimalist, which is called the procedural view, and substantive view, which is the maximalist view. The procedural dimension merely focuses on the procedures or means in place to attain democracy, and it argues that regular competitive elections on the basis of universal adult franchisee and plural political participation would produce a democratically elected government. And in his book, Joseph Schumpeter, in his book titled Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, has also supported this by saying that institutional arrangement for arriving at political decisions in which individuals acquire the power to decide by means of a competitive struggle for the people's vote. So, in a way he is giving his support to the idea of procedural democracy and the institutions that this democracy talks about. And similarly, the idea has been echoed by Huntington, who also says that the central procedure of democracy is the selection of leaders through competitive elections by the people they govern. So, the assumption over here is that once the proper procedures are in place, outcomes will come by default. You do not have to monitor or analyze the outcomes, the procedures should be in place, outcomes will follow by default. However, people are perceived as passive beyond electoral participation in minimalist view and thus are governed by their representatives. This view does not focus on liberty and freedom as it emphasizes how to elect a democratic government. As we said that this procedural democracy is the minimalist view. Why? Because what happens over here is that through these elections that it has been talking about since the beginning, we elect our representatives and that is where our job finishes. Now, what the laws of the country are going to be, what the policies the country is going to come up with, what is the nature of the governance is something where the control of the citizens or the electorate finishes. It is now completely the task of the representatives. So, therefore, the question of liberty and freedom again is questioned under this procedural democracy. And in the absence of checks and balances in the system, the elected leaders could manipulate procedures and power for their own benefit, leading to concealed authoritarianism. The government could work for the elites who hold power instead of the people who should hold ultimate authority in a democratic setup. So, the power then eventually goes to the representatives whom we placed on those pedestals. Terry Carl has pointed that minimalist view could also lead to a fallacy of electoralism, a situation where electoral process is given priority over other dimensions of democracy. So, what he is saying, what Terry Carl is saying is that this entire idea of procedural democracy leads to a kind of a fallacy of electoralism, where elections are given priority. The other dimensions of democracy which are equally and if not more important are reduced. Fareed Zakaria also opines on the same note and he calls it to be illiberal democracy, a case where governments are democratically elected but ignore constitutional limits on their power and deprive their citizens of basic rights and freedoms. So, this I think we have understood that procedural democracy focuses on how governmental decisions are made, while substantive democracy focuses on the results of the decisions. Another major proponent of this idea of procedural democracy, Robert A. Dahl, was a prominent American political scientist known for his contributions to the study of democracy, and he particularly is associated with the concept of procedural democracy. According to Dahl, procedural democracy emphasizes the importance of the processes and procedures through which democratic decisions are made, rather than solely focusing on specific policy outcomes. Dahl has argued that a democracy is functioning properly when certain key procedural criteria are met, like free and fair elections, voting rights, freedom of expression, associational autonomy, etc. And then he gave the concept of independent truth. So, what he is trying to say is that if these institutions, which is just talked about, elections and the voting rights and freedom of expression, if these are in place, then the outcomes are bound to be there. The people there in the government do not need to worry about the specific political outcomes, and therefore his concept of independent truth, which says that the idea in a democratic society there exists a shared understanding or consensus about certain basic facts and truths. These truths are not controlled or dictated by any single authority, institution or government. Instead, they emerge through open and informed public discourse among citizens. So, what he said is that this concept of independent truth, which has emerged not from one particular opinion or certain singled out institutions, instead this is something which has come out of informed and public discourse. So, therefore, once they have been decided, the rule of law has been decided, the institutions have been decided, then that becomes the independent truth of the state. And further, Dahl argues that an essential component of a healthy and functioning democracy is the presence of this independent truth. So, as long as this independent truth is there, democracies would function well. This means that citizens have access to accurate information and make informed decisions about their governance. Without this independent truth, democratic processes can be undermined by misinformation, manipulation and erosion of public trust in institutions. So, yes, he is again focusing on the importance of this independent truth, which is something which signifies procedural democracy. His concept of independent truth underscores the importance of a well-informed and engaged citizenry in sustaining a democratic system. It emphasizes that citizens can collectively arrive at an understanding of the truth that is not subject to undue influence or distortion. So, what is the question mark on Dahl's idea of independent truth? He is undermining, he is underscoring the importance of informed citizenry. He is assuming that once these institutions are put in place, then they don't need to get together to deliberate and discuss on the same issues. Things are settled. But that is something which again is not always true. That is something which can make us think over this idea of independent truth once again. So, procedural democracy, as we have said, emphasizes on procedure, and it is hoped that once we adopt a good procedure, public decisions would be automatically devoted to public welfare. It assumes that government by the people would necessarily prove to be government for the people. This is the underlying assumption of procedural democracy. I repeat, government by the people would necessarily prove to be government for the people, which, as we all know, might not always be right. I will just slightly compare it with substantive democracy, and then we will deal with substantive democracy in the coming lecture. But substantive democracy tries to overcome the shortcomings of procedural view, arguing that social and economic differences could hamper people's participation in the democratic process. It focuses on outcomes like social equality in order to truly work out for the governed. In a sense, it talks about common good rather than benefit of limited individuals. So, as we can see over here, substantive democracy is something which tries to deal with the limitations of procedural democracy. The kind of participation of people which is absent in procedural democracy is something which is taken care of in substantive democracy, and thereby the rights of the marginalized sections like women or the poor or the unrepresented are protected through redistributive justice, so that conditions can be created through state intervention for their participation in political process. So, in a nutshell, I would say that procedural democracy, or what as some scholars have called it to be illiberal democracy, is suitable for capitalism, whereas substantive democracy is something which is more suitable for socialist states. Procedural democracy and substantive democracy are two different approaches to understand and evaluate democracies, and they focus on different aspects of democracy. So, today we tried to get an understanding of what procedural democracy is. We started with the elements of democracy and then why democracies are beneficial to us, after which we tried to gain an understanding of what procedural democracy is and how we need to understand also about substantive democracy to gain a more holistic understanding of procedural democracy. This will be over for the day. We will be continuing in the second part with the same topic. Thank you.